Our next speaker, Rex Moncur, first licensed as an amateur, 1960, graduated in 1962 with communications engineering qualifications, started off working for the Bureau of Meteorology and many engineering aspects to radiosondes. I got it right that time. And the network, which also extended obviously to Antarctica. 1973 moved into an administrative role in head office in the Department of Science in Canberra. And then in 1985 moved to Hobart as the Deputy Director of the Australian Antarctic Division with major tasks of the Antarctic rebuilding program. And then in 1988 was offered the directorship of the AAD and was there for 10 years. And Rex's presentation covers what I've termed here the good, the bad and the challenging times of being a director of the AAD. So welcome, Rex.
I should thank Ellie for her talk. I really enjoyed it. I must admit, when I was thinking of this talk and the challenges, I thought most of the challenges are people problems, but I'm not game to talk about them because other people are still alive. So I will look at engineering challenges rather than people, but now, what buttons do I press?
Just that one.
That one. Yep. Okay, here is Antarctica. It's about 1.5 times the size of Australia. And Australia claims, well, this blue area, which is about 41% of Antarctica, and is about the same size of Australia less Queensland. Now, Alice talked about Mawson, and Mawson explored the little to your right-hand section back in the 1911-12 era. He did it, as Ali pointed out, come into the other section with Wild's group. But he did most of his exploration and mapping of the coast in the Banzari, which stands for British Australian New Zealand Antarctic Expedition, and mapped the whole coast. The left-hand end is the 45-degree longitude line, and he did a deal with the Norwegians that they would explore up to the 45, and he would explore from the 45 backwards. When he got there, his ship couldn't penetrate the ice so that he could get to the land. And what he did is he got this little Gypsy Moss aircraft, flew to the 45-degree line, threw a flag out the window and said, "I claim all of that." And not only that, he claimed it all to the South Pole, which he was still some 2,000 kilometres away. Now you notice there's a little cheese slice in the middle of our claim, and that's the French claim. And the French, a Frenchman named de Monteville, explored that little section in 1840, a long time before we had anything to do with the place. I should add, when Mawson claimed this territory, he claimed it for the King of England, because the King of England was really the King of Australia in those days. And it was formally transferred to Australia in 1936 by the British government. While we talk about claims within the Antarctic Treaty system, the reality is this is Australian Antarctic territory, and if you're an Australian and you work under Australian law, then this is part of Australia. And while other claimant states tend to recognise our claims on a quid pro basis, there are within the Antarctic Treaty system countries who don't recognise our claims. And then there's a slab of Antarctica, which I won't try and point out, which is not claimed at all, where Admiral Byrd, the American, did all the exploration, and they had a bill before their Congress to claim it and put it into law, and they decided, we're not going to claim it, we will reserve the right to claim the lot. Then after the war, when we started the Cold War, the Russians started building bases in Antarctica, and they said, well, if the Americans reserve the right to claim the lot, we will also reserve the right to claim the lot. So we've got all these different categories of countries involved. Now, after Mawson had got all this for us, we'll go on to the next slide. And this one you've seen a number of times in Ali's presentation, and I will just repeat it because here is Walter Hannam, the first secretary of what wasn't actually called the WIA when he was secretary of it. It was a sort of a New South Wales wireless branch or something. And his call sign was XQI, which is not a sort of call sign we recognise today, but I guess there weren't too many people with call signs in those days, so XQI was sufficient to define a unique call sign. Now, at the other end of Mawson's link, Alice pointed out Macquarie Island. Here is our club rooms up on the Queen's Domain, and this is where the other end of the link to Mawson's expedition occurred. So we've got a lot of association between our club, the Wireless Institute, and Mawson's expedition. Now, my first awareness of Antarctica was when my dad, who was VK7MO, worked Heard Island in 1949 when the first Inari expeditions went to both Macquarie and Heard Island. This is a photo of Heard Island. It is the most spectacular place I have ever been to on Earth. You've got an active volcano, and I had the opportunity to fly over the top when it was red and you could see the lava in. Down below there are lava tubes where you can walk inside with green mosses, thousands of seals, probably millions of penguins, and I just loved the place. I only spent about 2 days there, but a really spectacular place.
And Rex, that's the highest. That's the highest mountain in Australia.
In the Australian territory.
It's Australia's highest mountain, but it's not the highest mountain in Australia.
Okay.
Because it is Australian territory, but that's true. Okay. Now, I visited Heard Island, I think about 1987, and here is the wireless equipment that was used at Heard Island. Some of you will recognise an AR8 receiver and an AT5 transmitter. Actually, I'm not sure too many of you will recognise it, but these were manufactured in Australia during World War II. Unfortunately, the building had blown away and they were all starting to corrode. But this was the link with Heard Island I had later on. When I started as Deputy Director of the Antarctic Division, the OTC had decided to close down their HF radio network, which provided communications to Antarctica and a lot of the external territories. And fairly soon after I arrived, the then director asked me to comment on the proposed satellite system. Now, the Antarctic Division engineers had proposed a single satellite system, which was a Pacific satellite, which would service Macquarie Island and Casey, but couldn't see Mawson or Davis. And they were fairly in love with this, and what they wanted to do was use a troposcatter link from Casey to Mawson, Casey to Davis and then to Mawson. Now, I wasn't aware of the problems this would create at the time, but I have subsequently published papers on troposcatter. And the reality is any troposcatter link of more than about 800 kilometres is just not going to work. Fortunately, the OTC came up with a second option, which was to use an Indian Ocean satellite and a Pacific satellite. The Indian Ocean satellite to service Davis and Mawson. And I went and visited them to make a recommendation to the then director. And while I wasn't aware of the troposcatter problem at the time, it's very fortunate that I didn't go along with the engineer's recommendation. And I'm sure Peter's pretty happy that I didn't. Now, the other problem that the director asked me to look at was the Antarctic rebuilding program. This had been started about 10 years earlier with a proposal to government that it would cost $20 million. And at the time I got there, we'd spent about $100 million on the rebuilding program. The rebuilding program was being implemented by what was then the Department of Housing and Construction. And the Department of Finance were basically getting very annoyed about these cost overruns. And so I was given the job of trying to rationalise how we would finish this program, talking to both the Department of Housing and Construction and talking to the Department of Finance. And it took a lot of talking to get agreement to a way forward. We did trim the costs somewhat by starting to build buildings as modules and shipping them down, but it didn't trim it a lot, but it was enough to at least convince finance that we were making a reasonable attempt to get it down. They still put other things in our way, like they would say, oh, you've got to go through the Parliamentary Public Works Committee to get agreement for the next building, and this slowed things down. And the other problem was there'd been no allowance in this $20 million for shipping. The basic proposal had been put up on the basis that this would be small stations like existed before. And the reality was a combination of the Antarctic Division asking for everything they wanted, and the Department of Housing and Construction, thinking they had a new goal in life to be architects and engineers, meant the buildings grew much larger, and we didn't have the capability of even shipping the material. And so we then had to convince the Department of Finance to give us more money for a second ship, which turned out to be the Iceberg. Okay. Now, the Antarctic Treaty. Back in the early 1950s, Australia was getting worried because the Russians had built 4 bases on our territory. And we sort of had a choice: kick them out in the middle of the Cold War, or find a way around this problem. Now, Lord Casey, who was the Minister for, I think it was called External Affairs in those days, played a personal role in negotiating the Antarctic Treaty. And the most important part of this was, I mean, the worry was we had Russian bases, and they may well become Russian submarine bases, and we would have to defend both to the north, because we were all worried about the Reds coming from the north, and the Russians coming from the south. And the basic agreement was that there would be no military activity in Antarctica, despite the fact that military equipment is allowed for the purposes of supporting Antarctic expeditions, and that there was an inspection system set up such that you could check on everybody else. Very expensive to just trip over and check. But I did have the opportunity to visit the Russian station at Murney and do an inspection under the Antarctic Treaty. Under the sort of, you can inspect at any time, but the convention is you give them about a day's notice so they can put their military equipment away. And the reality is, at this time, they were pretty friendly. And you can see in this slide, they'd actually put the Australian flag up to welcome us. When we did the inspection, we had started to become very environmentally conscious, and they had an enormous rubbish dip just outside their station. But they found their environmental planner and introduced me to him as a way of, they were conscious that they had a few things to do. Okay. Now, the protection of the Antarctic environment, when I took over the job as the director, we were still arguing that the Antarctic Treaty parties had spent 10 years negotiating what was called the Minerals Convention, and that the whole system depended on everyone working together by consensus. And it had very good environmental controls in the Minerals Convention, by the way. It also had some nice sovereignty goals in it, which meant we had control as a claimant state on what actually happened. But the environmental movement started increasing the political pressure. Foreign Affairs advised their Minister, Gareth Evans, you can't pull out of this after it's all been agreed and signed. We did the same. And I get a phone call from my Minister, Graham Richardson, who's over in New Zealand. He said, Rex, and New Zealand had been responsible for supporting the negotiation of this at very big expense, running Antarctic Treaty meetings. And he was talking to the New Zealand Environmental Minister, And he said, well, if you don't sign, it won't worry me. I don't know whether that me meant New Zealand or him personally. And he rang me up, he says, told me this, and he says, Hawkeye really wants this. Fairly soon after that, Hawkeye actually made the decision not to sign. In my view, this was clear evidence that Hawkeye, which was Prime Minister Bob Hawke, was the real decision maker. Keating claims he was, but I obviously, once the government had made a decision, I had to change the whole focus of the Antarctic program. Our upper atmosphere people got a little bit concerned that I was no longer interested in things like auroral physics, but we found a way of giving you a job, didn't we? Which had upper atmosphere environmental implications. So on this basis, I moved to refocus the Antarctic Division on these goals. And well, the first thing was negotiating the Madrid Protocol. And my job was to actually negotiate all of the annexes to the protocol for its implementation. And these are the annexes there, such as environmental impact assessment. Foreign Affairs' job was really to get the head instruments, and there was really only one clause in it that they wanted, which is no mining in Antarctica, which was the headline, but all the work's here. So the new focus for the Antarctic Division was these 4 goals, which I negotiated both within the division and up the line. And they stood pretty well for probably 20 years. I think sovereignty and defence implications in China have started to change the rules. Now, in terms of climate change, there's some really interesting things about Antarctica. The sea ice forms around Antarctica to about 1.5 times the area of Antarctica, another half every year. And as the sea ice forms, it forms essentially as nearly fresh. And that means the sea under it has a higher salt content and is denser and flows down. And so you see these cold, salty, deep waters flowing from Antarctica right up round with warm water coming back the other way. And this is providing a balancing system on the climate. It's also bringing oxygen from the surface and nutrients all around the world's oceans. So understanding what is called the ocean conveyor belt, and we moved a lot into oceanography in conjunction with CSIRO, and this building and organisation would be very much involved in it. What I'm really saying is I think the ocean conveyor belt, which is driven from Antarctica, is probably one of the most critical things that Antarctica contributes to keeping the world stable and livable. Now, I will quickly go through some examples of Murphy's Law, and this is this is where ham radio comes in, because we've all experienced Murphy's Law every time your gear doesn't work. I as I said earlier, I have deliberately not talked about the people aspects of Murphy's Law, but these are engineering things. I was a voyage leader on the Iceberg going south. The captain came to me, he said, "Rex, we've got a problem," and the engines had stopped, and I thought, why are we stopped halfway to Antarctica? This was the problem. The drive gear had actually split in half. The reality was, though, providing you went forward, it tended to bind itself together. But if you went, it was wobbling and the bearings were overheating, so you couldn't go at more than 3 knots and before it got too hot. Well, halfway to Antarctica at 3 knots takes a long time to get back to Hobart. One morning I got up and I saw, Bruny Island, we're home. And that was at 6 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't until 7 o'clock at night that we got to the got to the wharf out of Hobart. Another example, Neladan went on the rocks at Macquarie Island. Basically, the anchor dragged. They had a policy of stopping the engines because we used to use fuel lines to the shore and you didn't want the propellers running. And the reality is it took so long when it started to drag to get the engine going, it dragged right onto the shore. I was actually on the Iceberg at the time and had to come and pick up all the Neladan people and bring them back to Australia, as well as our own people. This is another example. I was called into the division one Saturday afternoon by the logistics manager who said, the voyage leader on Iceberg wants to come home. And I said, why does he want to come home? Oh, there's some noises in the hold. I said, that doesn't seem a good reason to come home. What had happened is one helicopter had broken loose and smashed up 2 other helicopters. Here's another example. One of the things, this is Aurora Australis, and this is another example of the difficulty of doing things for the first time. And I'm sure you're going to have the same problems with the new Antarctic ship, but with Aurora Australis, it worked fine with its normal sea trials until it hit the ice. And when it hit the ice, it has 2 engines which are coupled together with a control system. But when this control system reacted to the ice, it drove one engine slightly different speed to the other, and these rubber couplings were just ripped apart. Okay, now since retiring from the Antarctic Division, most of the hams in the audience will notice that I went back to my youth interest in ham radio. I sent some a 144 meg transceiver and a Yagi down to Macquarie Island with one of the radio techs, and I was lucky. I only thought I could work them on meteor scatter on 2 meters, and we're quite successful in working Macquarie Island via meteor scatter. I thought that they could probably work some of the big American stations on EME, and I made all the arrangements, and I was listening to this and I was starting to get some evidence of a signal. So I started calling them. They only had 100 watts and a single Yagi, but fortunately And what I think happened is they're close to the sea and they were getting a ground reflection which was adding to the signal level. And we got through on EME with, I had 4 Yagis and I have a high power permit for 2 metres EME. So they copied me okay. And it took about an hour to get through, sort of waiting for things to get in and out of phase. But we did get through.